The storm descended on Blackwater Ridge with the kind of fury that locals claimed only visited once in a generation. Lightning tore across the sky, illuminating the jagged coastline of northern Maine, where the Atlantic crashed against the unforgiving rocks below. It was October 1887, and the small fishing village, perched precariously between dense forest and raging sea, seemed to withdraw into itself as nature unleashed its wrath. Atop the highest point of the ridge stood Delaney House, a once grand Victorian mansion, now weathered by decades of salt air and neglect. Its windows glowed with an eerie amber light as the tempest raged, the only sign of human presence for miles in any direction. Few outsiders knew of Blackwater Ridge, and fewer still knew of the Delaney family, a fact that suited its inhabitants perfectly. But what happened there between 1887 and 1891 would eventually be documented in a collection of papers discovered in 1963, sealed in a metal box beneath the floorboards of what was once the master bedroom. The contents of this box, journals, letters, medical records, and a series of daguerreotypes, would reveal a history so disturbing that the Maine Historical Society debated whether they should be made available to the public at all. The documents tell the story of Dr. James Whitman, a physician from Boston who arrived at Blackwater Ridge on that stormy night in October 1887. Traveling by horse-drawn carriage, he had been summoned to the remote location by a letter that promised both professional intrigue and substantial compensation. The letter, signed by Edmund Delaney, patriarch of the Delaney family, spoke of a unique medical condition affecting his children. One that defied conventional diagnosis and required the expertise of a doctor with Whitman's reputation for handling unusual cases. Dr. Whitman's journal entry from that first night captures his initial impressions. October 17th, 1887. I have arrived at Delaney House after what must be described as the most treacherous journey of my professional career. The carriage could proceed no further than the village, and I was forced to complete the final mile on foot, through wind and rain that seemed determined to drive me back. The house itself is imposing, though in a state of evident disrepair. Mr. Delaney greeted me with curious formality, as though my arrival was both desperately needed and somehow intrusive. His wife, Evelyn, spoke not a word during our introduction, her eyes downcast and her hands trembling slightly. I have been given comfortable, if austere, accommodations in the East Wing. Of the children, I have yet to see any sign, though I distinctly heard what sounded like a child's laughter as I was shown to my room. Most peculiar, given the hour and the storm. I am told I shall meet them tomorrow. What Dr. Whitman could not have known then was that his arrival at Delaney House would mark the beginning of a 4-year investigation that would challenge not only his medical knowledge, but his very understanding of reality. The case would eventually consume him, as evidenced by the increasingly erratic handwriting in his later journal entries. The morning after his arrival, Whitman was introduced to the Delaney children, or rather, to 3 of them. Edmund Delaney proudly presented his sons, William, age 12, Thomas, age 10, and Henry, age 8. They were pale, solemn-faced boys with the same deep-set blue eyes as their father. They answered Dr. Whitman's questions politely, but offered little beyond what was directly asked of them. It was during this initial examination that Dr. Whitman made his first puzzling observation, recorded in his medical notes. The 3 Delaney boys present with no obvious physical abnormalities or symptoms of illness. They are somewhat underweight for their ages, and their skin has a pallor consistent with insufficient exposure to sunlight. William displays a slight tremor in his right hand when at rest. Thomas exhibits delayed responses to certain questions, particularly those regarding his daily activities. Henry maintains almost no eye contact. When I inquired about their education, Mr. Delaney informed me that all their children are educated at home by Mrs. Delaney and occasionally by tutors brought from Portland. The phrase, "all their children," did not escape Dr. Whitman's notice, and later that day he broached the subject with Edmund Delaney in the privacy of the latter's study. A room lined with books on subjects ranging from anatomy to spiritualism, illuminated by a single oil lamp and the grey light filtering through rain-streaked windows. "Mr. Delaney," Whitman began, accepting the glass of whiskey offered to him. "Your letter mentioned children, plural, suffering from an unusual condition. I've examined William, Thomas, and Henry, but they appear, physically at least, to be in reasonable health." Edmund Delaney's expression remained impassive as he took a seat across from the doctor. He was a tall man with a full beard, streaked with grey, and eyes that seemed to hold something between sorrow and calculation. "You are quite observant, Dr. Whitman," he said after a moment. "Indeed, there are more than the 3 sons you've met. We have 8 in total." "Doctor," Whitman couldn't hide his surprise. "8 sons, Mr. Delaney? That's quite remarkable." "Yes," Edmund replied, taking a slow sip of his whiskey. "The others, they suffer from a condition that makes them sensitive to strangers. We thought it best to introduce you gradually." "I understand." Whitman nodded, though he found the explanation somewhat inadequate. "And what is the nature of this condition that prompted you to seek my help?" Edmund Delaney leaned forward, lowering his voice despite the fact that they were alone in the room. "They know things, Doctor. Things they couldn't possibly know. I'm afraid I don't follow. They speak of places they've never been, people they've never met. They recall events that occurred before they were born, with details no child could fabricate." Edmund's knuckles whitened around his glass. "And they speak with one another when they're not in the same room." Dr. Whitman remained silent, allowing Delaney to continue. "At first we thought it was merely the overactive imagination of children. But then—" He paused, seeming to struggle with his next words. "They began to know things about Evelyn and myself, private things, secrets that no one else could know." Dr. Whitman's scientific mind immediately began to form hypotheses, eavesdropping perhaps, or tales told by servants. But something in Edmund Delaney's demeanor suggested a man not easily given to flights of fancy. "When might I meet the other boys?" Whitman asked finally. "Soon," Edmund promised, "when they are prepared for your presence." The following days established a routine. Dr. Whitman would examine the 3 boys he had met, conduct general health assessments, and engage them in conversation designed to evaluate their mental faculties. They were intelligent children, if reserved, and showed no signs of delirium or mental instability that might explain their father's concerns. It was during one of these sessions on his 4th day at Delaney House that Dr. Whitman first heard mention of the other brothers. He was speaking with Thomas alone, in what had once been a solarium, but now served as a schoolroom, its glass ceiling clouded with years of salt residue and neglect. The boy had been identifying constellations on a star chart with impressive accuracy. "You have quite a knowledge of astronomy," Whitman remarked. "James taught me," Thomas replied simply. "He knows all the stars." "James?" Whitman inquired, maintaining a casual tone. "Is he one of your brothers?" Thomas's eyes widened slightly, as though realizing he had said something he shouldn't have. "Yes," he answered after a moment. "He's older than William." "I see. And do you have other brothers besides William, Henry, and James?" Thomas looked toward the door, then back at Dr. Whitman. "Yes," he whispered. "But we're not supposed to talk about them." "Why is that, Thomas?" "Because they're different," the boy said, his voice dropping even lower. "They come and go." Before Whitman could ask what he meant by this cryptic statement, the door opened, and Evelyn Delaney entered the room. She was a slender woman with auburn hair pulled back severely from a face that might once have been beautiful, but now seemed permanently etched with worry. "Thomas, it's time for your mathematics lesson," she said, not looking directly at Dr. Whitman. "Dr. Whitman, my husband would like to speak with you in his study." Thomas gathered his books and left without another word, following his mother with the obedience of a much younger child. In Edmund's study, Whitman found the man poring over a large ledger, which he closed abruptly upon the doctor's entrance. "Ah, Dr. Whitman, please, sit." Edmund gestured to the chair across from him. "How are your examinations progressing?" "The 3 boys I've met appear to be in good health, Mr. Delaney," Whitman replied, taking the offered seat. "Though I must confess I'm still uncertain as to why you've brought me here. You mentioned a condition, but I've observed nothing that would require my specialized attention." Edmund nodded slowly. "Tomorrow," he said, "you will meet James. He is the most articulate about his experiences. Thomas mentioned him today, said he taught him about the stars." Something flickered across Edmund's face. Surprise, perhaps, or concern. "Yes, James has always had an interest in astronomy. His knowledge exceeds what we've taught him." That night, unable to sleep, Dr. Whitman began a systematic review of his notes, comparing them with what he had observed in the house. Something about the Delaney family didn't align with conventional explanations, and for a man of science, inconsistencies demanded investigation. He decided to explore the house under cover of darkness. Taking a small lamp, he moved quietly through the corridors of the east wing, where his room was located. The house was silent, save for the occasional creak of settling wood and the distant sound of waves crashing against the cliffs below. As he passed what he believed to be the boys' bedrooms, he paused. From behind one door came the soft sound of whispering. Whitman leaned closer, straining to hear. "He's outside," a young voice said, one he didn't recognize. "He won't understand," replied another unfamiliar voice. "He's not supposed to," said a third. "Not yet." Whitman stepped back, startled. The voices fell silent. After a moment's hesitation, he knocked gently on the door. No response came. When he tried the handle, he found it locked. Continuing his exploration, Whitman discovered a narrow staircase at the end of the corridor that led to the 3rd floor. Here, he found a series of smaller rooms, their doors all closed. As he moved down the hallway, the temperature seemed to drop noticeably. His lamp flickered, the flame dimming as though starved for oxygen. At the end of the hall stood a door unlike the others, heavier, with an iron latch rather than a conventional handle. It was secured with a padlock. As Whitman approached this door, a sensation of unease washed over him. The rational part of his mind attributed this to the late hour and the general atmosphere of the old house. Yet he couldn't shake the feeling that something beyond the door was aware of his presence. A floorboard creaked behind him. Whitman turned to find Evelyn Delaney standing at the top of the stairs, a candle in her trembling hand, her nightgown billowing slightly in a draught that seemed to come from nowhere. "You shouldn't be here, Doctor," she said, her voice barely audible. "It's not safe after dark. Mrs. Delaney, I apologize for wandering. I was having trouble sleeping." "Please," she said, her eyes darting to the padlocked door and back to him. "Return to your room." As they descended the stairs together, Whitman ventured a question. "Mrs. Delaney, I understand you have 8 sons, yet I've only met 3. She stopped abruptly, her candle casting grotesque shadows across her face. "Who told you that?" "Your husband mentioned it." Her expression softened slightly, but the tension remained in her shoulders. "Yes," she said after a moment, 8 sons. God has blessed us abundantly. Might I ask their names and ages? For my medical records." Evelyn hesitated, then spoke as though reciting from memory. "William is 12, James is 14, Thomas is 10, Henry is 8, Samuel is 7, Daniel is 6, Matthew is 4, and David is 3. "Thank you," Whitman said, making a mental note of the information. "And they were all born here, at Blackwater Ridge?" "The first 4 were born in Boston," she replied. "We moved here after Henry's birth. The younger ones were born here with only a midwife from the village to assist." They had reached the 2nd floor, and Evelyn paused at the top of the main staircase. "Good night, Dr. Whitman," she said, in a tone that discouraged further questions. Back in his room, Whitman added these details to his notes. 8 sons, ranging from 3 to 14 years of age, born across 2 locations. Yet something nagged at him, a discrepancy he couldn't quite identify. The following morning, he met James Delaney. The boy was tall for 14, with the same blue eyes as his brothers, but with a gaze that seemed to hold something older, something that made Whitman inexplicably uncomfortable. Their conversation took place in the library, a room with floor-to-ceiling shelves that held more cobwebs than books. James sat with perfect posture in a high-backed chair, his hands folded in his lap. "My father says you're here to study us," James began, before Whitman could ask a question. "I'm here to help, if I can," Whitman replied carefully. "Your father is concerned about certain experiences you and your brothers have had." James smiled slightly. "You mean the knowing?" "The knowing? That's what we call it. When we know things we shouldn't." James tilted his head, studying Whitman with unnerving intensity. "Like how I know you have a sister named Margaret who died when you were 9. Scarlet fever. You were with her when she passed." Whitman felt the blood drain from his face. This information was accurate, disturbingly so, and not something he had shared with anyone at Delaney House. In fact, he rarely spoke of Margaret to anyone. "How could you possibly know that?" he asked, his scientific mind racing to find a rational explanation. "The same way I know there used to be a lighthouse on the point below before it was struck by lightning in 1843. The same way I know that in your bag you keep a small silver locket with a strand of red hair inside." James leaned forward slightly. "We just know, Dr. Whitman. All of us. Some things more clearly than others." Whitman struggled to maintain his professional composure. "And when did this knowing begin?" "We've always had it," James replied. "But it got stronger after we came here. After Samuel was born. Does Samuel have this ability too?" "Samuel, Daniel, Matthew, and David. All of them." James's expression changed subtly. "But you haven't met them yet, have you?" "No," Whitman admitted. "Your father says they're sensitive to strangers." James laughed, a sound devoid of humor and disconcertingly adult. "That's one way to put it." He glanced toward the window, where rain had begun to fall again. "You should ask to see the birth records, Doctor. If you're going to understand what's happening here, you'll need to start with the truth." Before Whitman could respond, Edmund Delaney entered the library. "That's enough for today, James," he said, his tone brooking no argument. "Go find your mother. She needs help with the younger ones." James stood, gave Whitman one last penetrating look, and left the room without protest. "An intelligent young man," Whitman observed once they were alone. "Too intelligent, some might say," Edmund replied, taking the chair his son had vacated. "What did you make of him?" "He knew things about me, Mr. Delaney, personal things I've shared with no one." Edmund nodded grimly. "As I said, they know things they shouldn't, things no child could know." "Has he been evaluated by other physicians?" "2. Both left convinced he was somehow reading their minds." Edmund ran a hand through his beard. "One suggested institutionalization, the other refused to return." Whitman considered his next words carefully. "James suggested I should ask to see birth records." Edmund's expression hardened. "Did he now? And why would that be of interest?" "As a physician, having complete medical histories would be valuable to my assessment." After a long moment, Edmund nodded. "Very well. I keep records in my study. I'll show you what I have." In Edmund's study, Whitman was presented with a leather-bound volume that contained handwritten entries detailing the births of the Delaney children. Each entry included a date, weight, and general health observations. The first 4 births had been attended by doctors in Boston, the later 4 by a midwife named Ruth Collins from the village. Whitman read through the entries carefully, making notes of his own. The information seemed comprehensive, yet something about it struck him as too neat, too consistent. "Would it be possible to speak with this midwife, Ruth Collins?" he asked. "I'm afraid not," Edmund replied. "She passed away last winter. Pneumonia took her quickly." Whitman nodded, concealing his disappointment. "And the doctors in Boston?" "You're welcome to contact them upon your return to the city," Edmund said, though his tone suggested he found the idea unnecessary. That evening at dinner, Whitman met Samuel Delaney for the first time. The 7-year-old boy was smaller than Whitman expected, with a pallor even more pronounced than his older brothers. He ate little and spoke less, responding to questions with single words or nods. As the meal concluded, Samuel suddenly fixed his gaze on Whitman and spoke unprompted for the first time. "You went upstairs last night, to the locked door." The table fell silent. Edmund and Evelyn exchanged a look that Whitman couldn't interpret. "Samuel," Evelyn said softly, "it's time for bed. Say goodnight to Dr. Whitman." The boy slid from his chair but maintained eye contact with Whitman. "They know you're here now," he said. "All of them." Evelyn quickly ushered Samuel from the dining room, leaving an uncomfortable silence in their wake. "You must forgive him, Doctor," Edmund said finally. "The younger ones are less filtered in what they share." "Who was he referring to?" Whitman asked directly. "Who knows I'm here?" Edmund's eyes briefly flicked upward, toward the 3rd floor. "It's just childish talk," he said, though his voice lacked conviction. "Pay it no mind." Later that night, unable to sleep once again, Whitman found himself drawn back to the 3rd floor. This time he brought not only his lamp, but also a small set of tools that might prove useful in examining the padlocked door more closely. The corridor was as cold as before, perhaps even more so. His breath fogged in the air before him as he approached the heavy door at the end. The padlock gleamed dully in the lamplight. As he reached for it with his tools, a small voice spoke from behind him. "You shouldn't open it." Whitman turned to find Daniel, the 6-year-old he had yet to formally meet, standing in the hallway in a white nightshirt, his feet bare on the cold wooden floor. "Daniel," Whitman said, keeping his voice gentle, "what are you doing up at this hour?" "Waiting for you," the boy replied matter-of-factly. "James said you'd come back here." "Did he? And why shouldn't I open this door?" Daniel took a step closer, his small face serious in the dim light. "Because once you see, you can't unsee. And once they know you know, they won't let you leave." A chill that had nothing to do with the drafty corridor ran through Whitman. "Who are they, Daniel?" he asked, setting his lamp on the floor and kneeling to the boy's level. Daniel glanced at the padlocked door, then back to Whitman. "The others," he whispered. "The ones who look like us, but aren't us. I don't understand." And the boy's eyes, so similar to his brother's, seemed to hold a knowledge far beyond his years. "Father says we're special because we're 8 when we should be 3. The others, they come when we sleep. They use our faces." He touched his own cheek, as if to confirm it was still his. "But they don't belong here." Whitman struggled to make sense of the child's words. Was this some elaborate shared fantasy among the siblings, or something more troubling, perhaps evidence of a folie à famille, a shared delusional disorder? "Daniel," he said gently, "where are these others now?" The boy pointed up, toward the ceiling, or perhaps toward whatever lay beyond the padlocked door. "Waiting," he said simply. "They're always waiting." Before Whitman could ask another question, footsteps sounded on the stairs. Daniel's eyes widened. "She's coming," he whispered urgently. "Don't tell her I was here." With surprising speed, the child slipped past Whitman and disappeared down the dark corridor, leaving the doctor alone as Evelyn Delaney reached the top of the stairs, a candle in her hand. "Dr. Whitman," she said, her voice tight with barely controlled emotion. "Again you wander where you should not." Whitman rose to his feet, acutely aware of how his presence must appear. Mrs. Delaney, forgive me. I thought I heard a child in distress. Her eyes narrowed slightly. All the children are asleep in their beds, Doctor, as you should be. Of course, he nodded, retrieving his lamp. I'll return to my room immediately. As they descended the stairs together, Whitman ventured another question. Mrs. Delaney, may I ask what's kept behind that locked door? She paused on the landing, her candle flame wavering. Storage, she replied after a moment. Old furniture, trunks. Things we've no use for but cannot bring ourselves to discard. It was a plausible answer, yet something in her delivery, perhaps the slight tremor in her voice, suggested deception. I see, Whitman said, deciding not to press further. Good night, Mrs. Delaney. Back in his room, Whitman added to his growing collection of notes, recording his encounter with Daniel and the boy's cryptic warnings. The child's words echoed in his mind. Father says we're 8 when we should be 3. Whitman pulled out the transcription he had made of the birth records Edmund had shown him. 8 births, each meticulously documented, yet James had suggested there was something about these records he should question. Examining them again, Whitman noticed something that had escaped his attention earlier. The handwriting documenting the Boston births was markedly different from that recording the Blackwater Ridge births. Not unusual in itself, as different physicians would have made the entries. But the handwriting for all 4 Blackwater Ridge births was identical to Edmund's own handwriting in the letters he had sent Whitman. Furthermore, there were no signatures from the midwife, Ruth Collins. Just Edmund's neat documentation of dates, weights, and the brief notation, mother and child in good health, for each entry. This realization prompted Whitman to review his earlier notes. Evelyn had stated that the first 4 sons were born in Boston, and the younger 4 at Blackwater Ridge. But the birth record showed William 12, James 14, Thomas 10, and Henry 8 as the Boston births. This aligned with their current ages but contradicted what Whitman had observed. He had met William, Thomas, and Henry, but James had been introduced to him separately, almost reluctantly. Another discrepancy emerged. In his conversation with Thomas, the boy had mentioned that James was older than William, yet the birth records listed William as born in 1875 and James in 1873, making James the eldest, not William. Increasingly convinced that something was being concealed from him, Whitman decided his next step must be to verify the Boston birth records independently. The following morning, Whitman requested permission to travel to the village to send a telegram to his colleague in Boston, Dr. Harrison Mills. A professional matter requires my attention, he explained to Edmund over breakfast. I should be back by nightfall. Edmund seemed hesitant, but eventually agreed. Take the path down to the village, he instructed. Morris at the general store can help you send your telegram, but please return before dark. The path can be treacherous without proper light. The journey to the village took just over an hour on foot. Blackwater Village consisted of a handful of weathered buildings clustered around a small harbor, a general store, a church, a tavern, and perhaps 24 modest homes. The residents, primarily fishermen and their families, regarded Whitman with open curiosity as he made his way to the general store. Inside, a bell jingled as he entered. The proprietor, a stout man with a salt and pepper beard, looked up from behind the counter. You must be the doctor staying up at Delaney house, he said by way of greeting. Morris Hatcher. He extended a hand, which Whitman shook. Dr. James Whitman. News travels fast in a small community, I see. Morris chuckled. Not much happens here that folks don't know about. What can I do for you, doctor? I need to send a telegram to Boston. Can do. Morris nodded, reaching beneath the counter for a pad and pencil. Who's it going to? Whitman dictated a carefully worded message to Dr. Mills, requesting confirmation of the Delaney children's birth records from Boston General Hospital, where Edmund had claimed they were born. He paid for the telegram and asked when he might expect a reply. Weather permitting, We should have a response by tomorrow afternoon, Morris said, pocketing the money. I'll hold it here for you. With his primary task completed, Whitman decided to use his time in the village to gather what information he could about the Delaney family. Mr. Hatcher, he began casually, how long have the Delaneys lived at Blackwater Ridge? Morris considered the question. Must be going on 9 years now. They came in 78 or thereabouts. Keep to themselves mostly. Mr. Delaney comes down for supplies once a month. Mrs. Delaney we hardly ever see. And their children. I understand they have quite a large family. Something flashed across Morris's face. Discomfort, perhaps, or wariness. The Delaney boys, he said, lowering his voice slightly, though they were alone in the store. Yes, they have a brood up there. You've met them? Whitman pressed gently. Seen 'em more like, from a distance. Morris busied himself rearranging items on a shelf. Mr. Delaney brings 1 or 2 of them down occasionally. Quiet lads. Pale as ghosts, the lot of them. I was told a local midwife, Ruth Collins, assisted with the births of their younger children. Morris froze momentarily. Ruth, he said, his voice softening. God rest her soul, she was my wife's cousin. I understand she passed away recently. My condolences. Last winter. Took sick after. He trailed off, then seemed to think better of what he was about to say. Just took sick and never recovered. After what, Mr. Hatcher? Whitman asked. Morris glanced toward the door, then back at Whitman. After her last visit to Delaney House, he said finally. She came down that night in a state, shaking like a leaf she was, wouldn't speak of what she'd seen, only that she'd never go back, took to her bed the next day with a fever, was gone within the week. The bell above the door jingled, and a customer entered, a young woman with a child in tow. Morris straightened, his demeanor instantly changing. Afternoon, Mrs. Peterson, he called, effectively ending his conversation with Whitman. Taking the hint, Whitman thanked Morris for his assistance and left the store. With several hours before he needed to return to Delaney House, he decided to visit the local church, reasoning that parish records might provide another source of information about the family. St. Matthew's was a modest wooden structure with a single steeple perched on a small hill overlooking the harbor. Inside, Whitman found the pastor, Reverend Thomas Clark, polishing brass candlesticks at the altar. Good afternoon, Father, Whitman greeted him. I hope I'm not interrupting. The Reverend looked up, surprised. Not at all, my son. We don't get many visitors in Blackwater, especially as winter approaches. He set aside his polishing cloth. How may I help you? Whitman introduced himself and explained his presence in the village, watching carefully for the Reverend's reaction to the mention of Delaney House. The Delaneys, Reverend Clark said, his expression carefully neutral. Yes, I'm familiar with the family, though they don't attend services here. Mr. Delaney once mentioned they practice their faith privately. I understand they have a large family, Whitman remarked. 8 sons, I believe. The Reverend's brow furrowed slightly. Is that so? I've only ever seen 3 of their boys on the rare occasions they come to the village. Which 3, if I may ask? The oldest one, William, I believe his name is, and 2 younger ones whose names escape me at the moment. This aligned with what Whitman had observed. William, Thomas, and Henry were the 3 children most readily presented to outsiders. Reverend Clark, Whitman said, deciding on a direct approach. Would your parish records include birth registrations for the Delaney children born here in Blackwater? The Reverend shook his head. I'm afraid not. As I mentioned, the family doesn't participate in our church. Any children born at Blackwater Ridge would have been registered with the county clerk in Ellsworth, not here. He paused, studying Whitman more carefully. May I ask why you're inquiring about the Delaney children, Doctor? Whitman chose his words carefully. I'm a physician. Mr. Delaney invited me to examine his children for a unique condition. I see, the Reverend said. though his tone suggested he found the explanation incomplete. After a moment's hesitation, he continued, "Doctor, we're a small community here. People talk, though often in whispers when it comes to Delaney House. There are stories." "What kind of stories, Reverend?" Reverend Clark glanced toward the church door, as if to ensure they were still alone. "Stories of lights in the windows when the family is known to be away. Of voices, children's voices, when only silence should prevail. Of figures seen on the ridge at night, too many to account for the known inhabitants." He sighed. "I put little stock in such tales myself. Isolation and superstition often go hand in places like Blackwater." "But," Whitman prompted, sensing the Reverend had more to say, "but Ruth Collins was a God-fearing woman, not given to flights of fancy. Before she died, she came to me for confession. What she shared." He shook his head. "I cannot break the sanctity of the confessional, Doctor. I can only say that Ruth was deeply troubled by what she had witnessed at Delaney House. She spoke of sins against nature and God's law. A church bell tolled the hour, startling both men." "I've taken too much of your time, Reverend," Whitman said, rising to leave. "Thank you for speaking with me." "Dr. Whitman," the Reverend called as he reached the door. "Whatever your purpose at Delaney House, I urge caution. Some mysteries are better left unveiled." The walk back to Delaney House was uphill all the way, giving Whitman ample time to consider what he had learned. The village's knowledge of the Delaney family seemed limited to 3 sons, the same 3 he had initially met. Both Morris and Reverend Clark appeared uneasy when discussing the family, suggesting a collective wariness that transcended mere gossip. Most troubling was the information about Ruth Collins, the midwife who supposedly attended the births of the 4 younger Delaney sons. Both Morris and Reverend Clark indicated she had experienced something deeply disturbing at Delaney House shortly before her death, something that had frightened her enough to vow never to return. As Whitman neared the house, the sky darkened with approaching evening. The imposing structure loomed against the horizon, its windows glowing with lamplight. For a moment, he considered continuing past, returning to the village and taking the first available transportation back to Boston. But professional curiosity and concern for the children he had met compelled him forward. Edmund Delaney met him at the door, relief evident on his face. "Dr. Whitman, we were beginning to worry. Dinner is about to be served." The dining room was dimly lit, with candles providing most of the illumination. Evelyn sat at one end of the long table, Edmund at the other. Between them sat 5 children, William, Thomas, Henry, Samuel, and a small boy Whitman hadn't met before, presumably Daniel. "Dr. Whitman," Edmund said, gesturing to an empty chair, "join us, please. I believe you've met everyone except Daniel. Daniel, say hello to Dr. Whitman." The 6-year-old looked up briefly, his eyes meeting Whitman's with a flash of recognition. "Hello, Doctor," he said softly, then returned his attention to his plate. Whitman took his seat, noting the absence of James and the 2 youngest boys, Matthew and David. "Will James be joining us?" he inquired. "James is indisposed this evening," Edmund replied smoothly, "as are Matthew and David. The younger ones often retire early." The meal proceeded in near silence, broken only by the clink of silverware against plates and occasional murmured requests to pass dishes. Whitman observed the family dynamics carefully, noting how the children ate mechanically, with none of the fidgeting or chatter typical of young boys at a dinner table. As the meal concluded, Samuel suddenly looked up at Whitman, his eyes wide. "Did you send it?" he asked. Edmund's fork clattered against his plate. "Samuel," he said sharply, "that's enough." But the boy continued, his gaze fixed on Whitman. "The telegram. Did you send it to the doctor in Boston?" Whitman felt a chill run through him. He had told no one the specific purpose of his trip to the village. "Yes, Samuel," he answered truthfully. "I did." "It won't help," Samuel said with certainty beyond his years. "The records aren't there anymore. Father made sure of that." "Samuel." Edmund's voice thundered down the table. "Go to your room immediately." The boy slid from his chair without protest and left the dining room. An uncomfortable silence descended. "You must forgive him, Doctor," Edmund said finally, his composure returning. "As I've mentioned, the children sometimes say unusual things." "Indeed," Whitman replied, choosing his next words carefully. "Mr. Delaney, I must be frank. My examinations have revealed no physical condition that would explain the behaviors you've described. I'm beginning to think a different kind of specialist might be more appropriate. Perhaps someone with expertise in childhood psychological disorders." Edmund's expression hardened. "That won't be necessary, Doctor. We didn't bring you here to tell us what our children don't have, but to help us understand what they do have." "And what exactly is that, Mr. Delaney?" Whitman asked directly. "What do you believe is happening to your sons?" Edmund exchanged a glance with Evelyn, who had remained silent throughout the exchange. She gave a barely perceptible nod. "Very well," Edmund said, lowering his voice despite the absence of the children. "We believe they are vessels, conduits for something that existed here long before we arrived." He leaned forward. "When we came to Blackwater Ridge, we had 3 sons, William, Thomas, and Henry. Only 3, Doctor. Within weeks of our arrival, Evelyn discovered she was with child again. But the pregnancy was different, accelerated. Samuel was born just 4 months after we settled here." Whitman frowned. "That's not physiologically possible, Mr. Delaney." "I'm well aware of what medical science claims is possible, Doctor. Yet I witnessed it with my own eyes." Edmund's knuckles whitened around his napkin. "And then, a month after Samuel's birth, Evelyn was with child again. Daniel came even faster, 3 months from conception to birth. Then Matthew, then David, each pregnancy shorter than the last." "Mr. Delaney," Whitman began, struggling to maintain his professional demeanor, "what you're describing defies all known principles of human reproduction." "Yes," Edmund agreed grimly. "It does, as does the fact that each child was born with knowledge they couldn't possibly possess. Knowledge of this place, of events long past, of people long dead." He drew a deep breath. "We didn't understand at first, but then we found the journal in the attic, a diary belonging to Catherine Blackwater, who lived here in the 1840s, the original owner of the house." Whitman guessed. Edmund nodded. "She wrote of 8 sons, Doctor. 8 sons who all perished in a single night when the lighthouse was struck by lightning and burned. Their bodies were never recovered from the sea below." His voice dropped to a near whisper. "They're her sons, Dr. Whitman. Somehow they've returned through ours." Whitman sat in stunned silence, trying to process Edmund's extraordinary claim. It was preposterous, of course, a bizarre fantasy born perhaps of isolation and the peculiar atmosphere of Blackwater Ridge. Yet he couldn't dismiss the genuine conviction in Edmund's voice, nor the strange behaviors he had observed in the children. "You mentioned a locked room on the 3rd floor," Whitman said finally. "What's kept there?" "Evidence," Edmund replied after a moment's hesitation. "Proof that what I'm telling you is true. I'll show you tomorrow in daylight. It's not something to be seen at night." That night, sleep eluded Whitman entirely. He sat at the small desk in his room, reviewing his notes and struggling to find a rational explanation for the increasingly bizarre situation. Edmund's claim about accelerated pregnancies was, from a medical standpoint, impossible. Yet the conviction with which he had spoken suggested he truly believed what he was saying. More troubling were the children themselves. Their unnatural stillness, their cryptic statements, their knowledge of things they couldn't possibly know. Samuel had somehow known about the telegram to Boston. Daniel had been waiting for him at the locked door, as if forewarned of his nocturnal exploration. And then there was James, the eldest according to the birth records, yet introduced to him after the other 3. James, who had known about Margaret, about the lighthouse, about the locket Whitman indeed kept hidden in his medical bag. A soft knock at his door startled him from his thoughts. Whitman glanced at his pocket watch. 2:17 a.m. Who would be seeking him at this hour? He approached the door cautiously. "Who's there?" he called softly. "James, doctor," came the reply. "I need to speak with you. It's urgent." Whitman opened the door to find the 14-year-old standing in the corridor, a candle in his hand casting strange shadows across his face. The boy was fully dressed, as if he had never gone to bed. "May I come in?" James asked, his voice steady but low. Whitman stepped aside, allowing him to enter. "Your father said you were indisposed this evening." "My father says many things, doctor. Not all of them true." James placed his candle on the desk, next to Whitman's notes. His eyes scanned the pages briefly. "You're trying to make sense of us. You won't succeed. Not without all the facts. And what facts am I missing, James?" The boy turned to face him, his expression grave beyond his years. "The fact that I'm not James Delaney. None of us are truly Delaneys." He paused, seeming to consider his next words carefully. "We bear their faces, we occupy their bodies, but we are something else. Something older." A chill ran through Whitman. The boy's manner was uncanny, adult words from a child's mouth, delivered with unnerving conviction. "Who are you, then?" Whitman asked, deciding to engage with the delusion directly. "My name was James Blackwater," the boy replied. "I died in 1843, along with my brothers, when the lighthouse burned and we were swept out to sea. Our mother, in her grief, performed rituals she didn't understand, trying to call us back from the dead." He gestured toward the window, where the dark outline of the ridge was barely visible against the night sky. "This place holds us. It wouldn't let us leave, even in death." "And the Delaney children?" Whitman asked, his scientific mind still searching for a rational explanation, even as a deeper, more primitive part of him began to accept the impossible. "They were compatible," James said, choosing the word carefully. "Vessels that could contain us. We didn't mean to harm them. We just wanted to live again." A shadow passed over his face, "But we're not alone in them. The original souls remain, dormant most of the time. But sometimes they surface, like multiple personalities," Whitman murmured, grasping for a medical explanation. James smiled thinly. "If that comforts your scientific mind, doctor, then yes, like that." He moved toward the window, looking out at the darkness. "But there's more. The others, Matthew and David, they're different, darker. They were already changed by the sea when Mother called us back. They're the ones kept locked away." "Why are you telling me this, James?" The boy turned back to face him, his eyes reflecting the candlelight. "Because tomorrow, Father will show you the room. He'll show you the evidence, hoping you'll find a medical explanation, a cure. But there is no cure, doctor. We cannot be separated from the vessels without destroying them completely." He stepped closer. "And the others? They won't allow anyone to try. They've killed before. The midwife, she saw too much, understood too much. They made her sick, wasted her away from within." "Ruth Collins," Whitman said, remembering what Morris and Reverend Clark had told him. James nodded. "You need to leave, Dr. Whitman. Tonight, return to Boston and forget Blackwater Ridge." His voice dropped to a whisper. "I've managed to quiet the others for now, but I can't control them for long, especially not after you see the room." "What's in that room, James?" Whitman asked, a sense of dread building within him. "The truth," the boy replied simply. "Physical proof of what we are, what we've become." He picked up his candle, moving toward the door. "If you won't leave, then at least be prepared. When you enter that room tomorrow, you'll be seeing us as we truly are. Not as the Delaneys, but as the Blackwaters. The line between the living and the dead will blur, and once you cross it, there's no turning back." With those ominous words, James slipped out of the room, leaving Whitman alone with his troubled thoughts. Morning brought a heavy fog that shrouded Delaney House in a ghostly veil. Whitman, who had eventually fallen into a fitful sleep just before dawn, was awakened by a knock at his door. Edmund stood in the corridor, his face grave. "It's time, Doctor," he said without preamble, "to show you what I promised." They ascended to the third floor in silence, the house unusually quiet. Whitman had not seen Evelyn or any of the children at breakfast, and Edmund offered no explanation for their absence. At the padlocked door, Edmund produced a key from his pocket. His hand trembled slightly as he unlocked the heavy padlock. "What you're about to see," he said, his voice low, "I've shown to no one except Evelyn, the midwife. She glimpsed it by accident. It destroyed her." He pushed the door open, revealing a large room with windows that had been carefully boarded up, allowing only thin strips of gray daylight to filter through. The air inside was cold and carried a faint, unfamiliar scent, something between the saltiness of the sea and the mustiness of old paper. As Whitman's eyes adjusted to the dimness, he began to make out the contents of the room. Against one wall stood 8 small beds, arranged in a neat row. Each bed was made up with white linens, pulled taut and precise. At the foot of each bed was a small trunk, and above each hung a framed daguerreotype. "The original Blackwater children," Edmund said, gesturing to the photographs. "From Catherine Blackwater's collection. We found them in the attic when we moved in." Whitman moved closer to examine the images. 8 boys, ranging from what appeared to be around 3 to perhaps 15 years of age, stared back at him with solemn expressions typical of early photography. What struck him immediately was the resemblance, not just to each other, as would be expected of siblings, but to the Delaney boys he had met. "The similarity is remarkable," he said carefully. "It's more than similarity, Doctor," Edmund replied. "Look at the beds." Whitman approached the nearest bed, the smallest, presumably belonging to the youngest Blackwater child. The white linens he had observed from a distance were not white at all, but stained with a brownish substance that had dried and darkened with time. As he moved down the row, he saw that each bed bore similar stains. "What is this?" he asked, though a growing horror told him he already knew. "Blood," Edmund confirmed. "It seeps through the mattresses, through the sheets, no matter how many times they're changed. It began after David, our David, was born. At first, just a few drops. Now," he gestured helplessly at the heavily stained bedding. "And no one is sleeping in these beds?" Whitman asked, his medical mind still struggling against the irrational. "No one living," Edmund said softly. "Yet every morning the indentations of bodies remain. Listen." Whitman stood still, straining his ears. At first he heard nothing but the distant sound of waves against the cliffs below. Then, gradually, he became aware of another sound. A faint, rhythmic noise like the breathing of multiple people, slightly out of sync with each other. "My God," he whispered. "There's more," Edmund said. Moving to a large cabinet against the far wall, he unlocked it with another key from his pocket and swung the doors open. Inside, arranged on shelves, were what at first appeared to be wax figures, 8 small forms dressed in children's clothing from an earlier era. As Whitman drew closer, however, he realized with mounting horror that these were not wax models, but actual bodies, mummified, preserved somehow, their skin drawn tight over bone, their empty eye sockets staring blindly. "The Blackwater children," Edmund said, his voice breaking slightly. "We found them sealed in the walls during renovations. Not in the sea, as legend had it, but hidden here all along. Catherine must have recovered them after the lighthouse fire and concealed them, unable to part with her sons even in death." Whitman staggered back, his scientific mind finally overwhelmed by what he was witnessing. This is desecration, Mr. Delaney. These remains should be properly buried, reported to the authorities." "We tried," Edmund said, a note of desperation entering his voice. "The first year we were here before we understood. We tried to remove them, to give them a Christian burial. That's when it started. The pregnancies, the changes in our boys. He ran a hand through his beard, now more gray than brown. They won't let us. They want to stay together, the living and the dead. A sudden draft swept through the room, causing the candles Edmund had lit to flicker violently. The breathing sound grew louder, more labored. They know we're here, Edmund whispered, his face pale. They know what we're discussing. The door to the room slammed shut with a force that shook the walls. Whitman rushed to it, twisting the handle, but it wouldn't budge. It's them, Edmund said, his voice rising with panic. They're angry. We need to... His words were cut off by a high, keening wail that seemed to emanate from the very walls of the room. The sound grew, multiplying until it seemed as though dozens of voices were crying out in unison. Children's voices filled with an ancient grief and rage. The daguerreotypes began to rattle in their frames, the glass cracking in spiderweb patterns. The blood-stained sheets on the beds rippled as if disturbed by invisible bodies. The preserved remains in the cabinet seemed to twitch, their mummified fingers curling slightly. "What's happening?" Whitman shouted over the cacophony, pressing his back against the door. "They're showing themselves," Edmund replied, his eyes wide with terror. "All of them together. It's never happened before, not like this." The air in the center of the room began to shimmer, like heat rising from summer pavement. Within this disturbance, forms started to take shape, translucent at first, then gradually solidifying. 8 boys arranged from tallest to smallest, their features identical to the Delaney children, but their clothing from another era. They stood in a semicircle, their eyes, dark hollow spaces where eyes should be, fixed on Whitman. The tallest stepped forward. Though his appearance was that of a boy of perhaps 14 or 15, his bearing was that of someone much older. When he spoke, his voice was James's, yet somehow deeper, resonating with an otherworldly timbre. "Now you see us as we are, Dr. Whitman," he said, "the truth you sought." Whitman felt his medical training and rational mind crumbling in the face of undeniable impossibility. Before him stood the ghosts of the Blackwater children, their translucent forms flickering like candle flames in a draught. "What do you want?" Whitman managed to ask, his voice barely audible above the continuing wail that filled the room. "To live," the apparition of James Blackwater replied simply. "To complete what our mother began. She called us back but couldn't give us form. The Delaneys provided that, vessels for our return." Edmund had sunk to his knees, his face buried in his hands. "We didn't know," he moaned. "We just wanted a home by the sea, somewhere quiet for the boys to grow." The spectral James turned his hollow gaze to Edmund. "You chose this place. It chose you in return." His attention returned to Whitman. "You came seeking answers, Doctor. Now you have them. But knowledge comes with responsibility." "What responsibility?" Whitman asked, struggling to maintain his composure, "to protect the secret, to ensure we remain undisturbed." The ghost child gestured toward the cabinet containing the mummified remains. "Our earthly vessels must stay here, with our spirit vessels, the Delaney boys. The circle must remain unbroken." The smallest ghost child, David, stepped forward, his movement jerky and unnatural, like a puppet on tangled strings. When he spoke, his voice was not that of a child, but something ancient and malevolent. "If you try to separate us," he hissed, "if you attempt to remove either vessel, we will take more. The village first, then beyond." A sudden pounding on the door startled Whitman. Evelyn's voice came through high with panic. "Edmund, Dr. Whitman, what's happening? The boys are convulsing." The apparitions flickered, their forms becoming less distinct. James's ghost looked toward the door, then back at Whitman. "Decide, Doctor," he said, his voice fading. "Join the secret, or join the dead." With those words, the spectral forms collapsed in on themselves, dissolving into mist that dissipated throughout the room. The wailing ceased abruptly, leaving an eerie silence broken only by Evelyn's continued pounding and Edmund's ragged breathing. Whitman found the door suddenly unlocked. He opened it to find Evelyn wild-eyed on the threshold, her hair escaping its usual severe styling. "The children," she gasped. "Something's wrong with them." They followed her down to the second floor, where all 5 Delaney boys Whitman had met were lying on the floor of the schoolroom, their bodies rigid, eyes rolled back showing only whites. James was among them, though Whitman had not seen him since their late-night conversation. Whitman rushed to check their vital signs, his physician's instincts temporarily overriding his terror. Each boy had a strong, steady pulse despite their alarming appearance. As he touched James's wrist, the boy's eyes snapped into focus, fixing on Whitman with unnerving intensity. "Have you decided, Doctor?" he asked in the same otherworldly voice Whitman had heard from the apparition. Before Whitman could respond, all 5 boys gasped simultaneously, their bodies relaxing as they returned to consciousness. They sat up, looking disoriented, like sleepers abruptly awakened. "What happened?" William asked, his voice once again that of a normal 12-year-old. "You were unwell for a moment," Whitman replied carefully. "How do you feel now?" "Hungry," Thomas said simply, and the other boys nodded in agreement. Evelyn quickly ushered them downstairs for lunch, leaving Whitman alone with Edmund, who had collapsed into a chair, looking decades older than he had that morning. "Now you understand," Edmund said, his voice hollow, "why we brought you here. Not for a cure, there is no cure, but for validation, for someone else to share the burden of knowing." Whitman remained silent, his mind racing. Part of him wanted to flee Blackwater Ridge immediately, to dismiss what he had witnessed as mass hysteria or an elaborate hoax. But the rational, scientific part of him, the physician sworn to do no harm, could not ignore the children caught in this supernatural nightmare. "The telegram I sent," he said finally. "What will it reveal?" Edmund smiled grimly. "Nothing. As Samuel said, the records aren't there anymore. I removed them years ago, when we first began to understand what was happening." Officially, the Delaneys had only 3 sons born in Boston. The others don't exist. And the midwife, Ruth Collins, she discovered the room accidentally, much as you did, saw the remains, began to suspect. Edmund's hands twisted in his lap. "I didn't want her harmed. I tried to warn her to stay away. But they don't tolerate threats to their existence." The implications were clear. The Blackwater spirits had somehow caused Ruth's illness and death when she learned too much. Now Whitman possessed the same dangerous knowledge. "What will you do, Doctor?" Edmund asked, watching him closely. It was the question that haunted Whitman over the following days as he remained at Delaney House, observing the children and documenting everything in his journal. The boys exhibited periods of normalcy, followed by episodes where their original personalities seemed subsumed by the Blackwater spirits. The youngest 2, Matthew and David, remained unseen, kept separate in a locked room that Whitman was told he should not attempt to enter. On his 7th day after witnessing the apparitions, Whitman returned to the village to collect the telegram reply from Dr. Mills. As Edmund had predicted, it confirmed that Boston General Hospital had records of only 3 Delaney births. While in the village, Whitman made a decision. He wrote 2 letters, one to his colleague in Boston, containing a sanitized account of his findings, and a recommendation that the Delaney children be left in their isolated environment for their own safety and that of others, and a second, sealed letter containing the full, unvarnished truth, addressed to the Maine Historical Society with instructions that it remain sealed until after his death. Upon his return to Delaney House, he found James waiting for him on the path, some distance from the house. "You've decided," the boy said. It wasn't a question. "Yes," Whitman replied. "I'll keep your secret. On one condition, no more deaths. The village must remain safe, and the Delaney children, your vessels, must be treated with care. Their souls still exist alongside yours. James nodded slowly. We can agree to this. As long as we remain undisturbed, there is no need for further harm. He looked toward the house, then back at Whitman. You'll be leaving soon. Tomorrow. Whitman confirmed. My work here is done, but you'll return, James said with certainty, to check on us, to ensure our bargain is kept. And so began Dr. James Whitman's strange association with Delaney House and its inhabitants. He would return to Blackwater Ridge twice yearly for the next 4 years, documenting the children's development and the increasingly rare appearances of their original personalities. His journals detail how, over time, the distinction between the Delaney boys and the Blackwater spirits became increasingly blurred, until it was difficult to determine where one ended and the other began. In his final entry, dated September 1891, Whitman wrote, I fear this shall be my last visit to Blackwater Ridge. My health fails, and I doubt I shall survive the winter. The Delaney children, if they can still be called such, continue their strange existence, neither fully alive nor truly dead. Edmund and Evelyn have aged dramatically, the toll of their secret etched into every line of their faces. They speak now of leaving, of abandoning the house to its original inhabitants. I have cautioned against this, for I believe the Blackwater spirits cannot exist far from their physical remains. To separate them might unleash consequences none of us can predict. As for the question that has haunted me these 4 years, are these children possessed, or are they something else entirely, something science has yet to classify? I leave the answer to those who may discover these papers after I am gone. I have seen too much to dismiss the supernatural entirely, yet too little to abandon my faith in rational explanation. Perhaps there exists a middle ground, where the souls of the dead and the living can coexist in one form. To whoever reads these words, proceed to Blackwater Ridge with caution. The house still stands. The children, however they may now appear, still wait within its walls. And should you hear a child's laughter on a stormy night when no child should be present, remember that at Delaney House, the line between the living and the dead has long since blurred beyond recognition. Whitman died in December 1891. According to local records, the Delaney family departed Blackwater Ridge that same winter, their destination unrecorded. The house remained abandoned until 1963, when a developer purchased the property with intentions to convert it into a seaside resort. During renovations, workers discovered the metal box containing Whitman's journals and other documentation hidden beneath the floorboards of the master bedroom. More disturbingly, they found a sealed room on the 3rd floor containing 8 small beds and a cabinet that had been emptied of its macabre contents. Of the Delaney family, or the Blackwater children, no further trace was ever found. But visitors to Blackwater Ridge, now a quiet historic district with a small museum dedicated to its maritime past, occasionally report seeing 8 boys walking along the cliffs at sunset, their forms silhouetted against the darkening sky. And in the village records, a curious notation appears every few decades. Births registered for male children who are never seen in public, who never attend the local school, who exist only as names in official documents. 8 names, always the same: William, James, Thomas, Henry, Samuel, Daniel, Matthew, and David. Do you believe in ghosts, dear reader? More importantly, do you believe in the possibility that the line between life and death is not as absolute as we've been taught? If you find yourself near the coast of northern Maine, perhaps you'll visit Blackwater Ridge and decide for yourself. But be warned, some secrets, once discovered, can never be forgotten. And the Blackwater children are always watching, always waiting for new vessels to continue their endless existence.